Okay, what we're going to do here in this lesson is we're going to take 104 divided by 8. But we're not going to divide it the traditional way that we normally use to solve these kinds of division problems. The essential question for the lesson is how can you use the strategy solve a simple problem to help you solve a division problem? What we're going to do is we're going to look at this 104 and we're going to break this up into simpler numbers. In order to break this up into simpler numbers, we need to take a look at the divisor to do that. Alright, so what we're going to do is we're going to come up with two numbers that add up to 104. And we're going to use this divisor. Normally what we do is we take this divisor and we multiply it by 10. We take that divisor, we multiply it by 10, we get 80. After we figure out that, we need to figure out 80 plus what gets us 104. In order to do that, you need to find the difference between 104 and 80, and that's subtraction. So if I was to find the difference between 104 and 80, I would get 4, 2, difference would be 24. So what we do here is we take the 80 and the 24 gets us 104. Now that we broke up this dividend into simpler numbers, the next step to solve this problem is to take each one of these numbers and divide it by the divisor. If I take 80 and divide it by 8, and then add that together with the 24 right here divided by 8 there, if I take that and I add that together, I'm going to get my quotient. 80 divided by 8, we know is 10. 24 divided by 8 is 3. If I take those two numbers and I add them together, I get my quotient of 13. 104 divided by 8 equals 13. Let me show you another problem. We're going to take this 96, we're going to divide it by 6, and we're going to use the same strategy we just used to solve the other problem. So, if I took this 96, I'm going to take it and break it apart into two numbers that add up to 96. I'm going to make the numbers simpler to deal with, to work with here. Alright? And I'm going to use that divisor to help me out. So like I said with the last example, we're typically going to find our first number here by multiplying this divisor by 10. So I know 6 times 10 gets me 60. So I need to find out what that other number is. 60 plus what is going to equal 96. In order to do that, like we did before, we need to find the difference between the dividend, which is 96, and this 60. If I subtract these two numbers, I wind up getting 36. Therefore, 60 and 36 equals my dividend. I took this 96 and I broke it down into simpler numbers. Once I have that broken down into simpler numbers, I take each one of these simpler numbers and I divide it by the divisor. So I take my 60 and I divide that by 6. And I take my 36 and I divide that by 6. If you take the 60 divided by 6, it equals 10. And if I take the 36 divided by 6, it equals 6. If you add those two numbers together, you're going to figure out your quotient for this problem here. 96 divided by 6 is going to equal 16. And like I was doing in class, I could prove that with my calculator. If I took my calculator and I did 96 divided it by 6, I get my answer of 16. What we're doing is we're taking this dividend, we're breaking it down into simpler numbers, and we're dividing those simpler numbers by the divisor and adding them together to figure out the quotient. We're going to try one more. Alright, so here's one more example. Here we have the dividend is 125 and the divisor is 5. We're going to break this 125 down into simpler numbers. We're going to think of two numbers that add up to 125, and we're going to use our 5 as a guide to help us here. Typically what we were doing with those last problems is we were taking this divisor, we were multiplying it by 10 to figure out the first number. So if I took that 5, I multiplied it by 10, I would get 50. Okay? Now, multiplying it by 10 might not be the best choice here, because if I take this number, multiply it by 10, I get 50. I still have to figure out the difference between 125 and 50. And if I take 125 and I subtract 50 from 125, that would get my second number of 75. 50 plus the 75 gets me this 125. These numbers might not necessarily be simpler, because if we could probably take the 50 divided by 5, we know that's 10, but the 75 divided by 5 might be a little bit more challenging. So this is what we're going to do. Instead of multiplying it by 5, we're going to multiply it by another multiple of 10. For example, we're going to use the number 20. If I take this 5, multiply it by 20, I get 100. Now, 100 plus what gets us 125? You have to find the difference between 125 and 100. Difference between 125 and 100 would be 25. So 125 are now the numbers that you're working with. You took this 125 and you created simpler numbers to work with. Like we were doing in those last steps, you take the 100, divide it by the divisor, which is 5, and you take the 25, divide that by 5. Once you take these two numbers, you add them together, and you get your final quotient. 100 divided by 5 would be 20. 25 divided by 5 is 5. Take those two numbers, add them together, and you get 25 as your answer. 125 divided by 5 equals 25. Now this last one here, what I want you to do is I want you to try this on your own. So what you could do at this point is you could press the pause button, and when you've completed the problem, press the play button to see if you solved it properly. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this 128 and I'm going to break it up into simpler numbers to deal with. Here we're going to use our divisor once again to help us break that number up. In the past, what we've been doing is we've been taking this divisor and multiplying it by 10 to get our first number. We multiply the 8 by 10, we get 80. Now what we need to do is we need to figure out the difference between 128 and 80 to figure out what that other number is. If I take 128 and I subtract 80 from that 128, I'm going to get 48 as my difference. Meaning 80 plus 48 equals 128. Now what you should be doing, or what you should have done, is you should have taken this 80 and divided it by 8. 80 divided by 8, of course, is 10. Then what you do is you take the 48 and you divide that by 8. 48 divided by 8 equals 6. once you figure out the quotients for each one of these problems, you take the two quotients, add them together, and that gives you your final quotient for the original problem. 128 divided by 8 would equal 16. And that's how you take a division problem and break the dividend into simpler numbers.